If your garden is anything like mine, you've been facing a lot of rain and even possibly some flooding. But today, we're going to discuss how to grow peas and beans even in cold, wet weather. It is during flooding that a traditional raised bed really earns its value, both in the cost and labor of installing it. But imagine that you still want to have a more in-ground solution for your peas or beans. You'll notice that the peas coloration is a lot lighter, kind of almost a white color, and a lot of that is because of the amount of rain that we've been having, and a lot of the nutrients are gone. But these things will carry through and survive even with this heavy rain, because for the most part the soil they're actually in drains well and it's not at a low spot where the water is collecting. But one thing I want to focus on is the actual planting of the peas or the beans. Generally speaking, I recommend starting peas by putting them in water and letting them soak overnight before the day that you want to plant them. This helps to jumpstart the germination of them and really make sure that you get a good germination, even if it happens to be cold outside where it wouldn't germinate quite as quickly. However, if your soil is going to be as damp as this is, I think you should skip that step. And so what I propose is that you actually just go ahead and plant the pea that is completely dry, and there will be enough moisture in the soil for it to germinate without much of a problem and hopefully not rot out that way. Again, you have to have warm enough conditions. You have to have some days with some warm sun coming up in your forecast when you plant them if you want to make sure that you do not end up having them just rot out. But all of the peas that you see planted here, I did plant from seed directly. That was dry seed. I did not pre-soak it, and these came up because of the heavy moist conditions that we've been having. A next step that I'm going to go ahead and do here is, as you notice, I have 2 lines across for these to grow up, but there are some of them here that are starting to get too tall. If you happen not to be familiar with growing peas, peas are a vining plant, and they have these natural tendrils that stick out from them, and the tendrils will actually grab on to a string that you have. So you can put up trellis netting, or as I'm doing here, just strings for them attached to. They'll grow up poles. There are a lot of different ways you can do it. Another thing that's worth noting is that peas will attach to each other. So if you plant a few pea plants that are relatively close, then they actually provide their own support structure where they're holding on to one another. And if you just have part of it that's supported generally with your trellis system or your lines like I have here, then it will support the entire pea network. Now these might be a little bit close. They might be competing for resources to some degree, but generally speaking, you can create kind of this growing system where they all grow together and get pretty good production and a stable pea out of it. Now obviously when you're looking at my pea bed here, the weeds need to go, and if I don't do something soon, they'll get to be big weeds, and then they'll actually be competing for resources with the peas. So ideally, don't let your bed get like this, and I need to do some work. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about beans. The package is torn there, but these are sunset runner beans. They have a pretty pink flower. I've grown these in a different year before, and they're really neat. They go a long distance because they are runner beans, even further than your average pole bean will go. And so I'm going to grow them up an archway. And one thing that I just recommend, first off, I should say this video talks about growing peas and beans. Lumping them together might be a little misleading, because peas are definitely a cold weather preferring crop. You'll want to plant them in early spring or into the fall because they don't do well in the summer heat. Beans, on the other hand, do like summer heat, and so you will want to plant them with an eye toward them being a main crop during the summer. And so you'll generally plant your peas earlier than you would plant your beans. And beans are similar in that I would generally recommend that you either soak them or actually sprout them using the paper towel method, which is where you wet a paper towel and put it inside of a Ziploc bag and then set the beans inside that Ziploc bag, sealed on top of that wet paper towel, and then wait for them to sprout, and then you can transplant your sprouts out into your garden, and that way you know that it is already germinated, which prevents the rotting. Today, since everything is so moist, we're going to go ahead and plant the beans without pre-soaking them, without sprouting them, in this very wet soil, and hopefully we'll get them to sprout. Now, rot is definitely an issue, although it's starting to warm up enough that I'm not as worried about it. So I'm pulling back the mulch layer here and just planting the seed in that moist soil below. But if you are worried that your seeds are going to rot, then you can just start the seeds in a pot and transplant them once they're already plants out into your garden. That's another way you can avoid that rot problem. But then you do have to make sure that if you're starting them outside, you're keeping them moist enough so that they germinate. And if you're starting them inside, you have to deal with the hardening off process before you can plant them. Anyhow, this is how I did it. If you have suggestions, please let me know below, or if you think something I did was foolish, let me know that too. I always appreciate learning more, and am learning just with you. So if you aren't subscribed to the channel, please do subscribe, and thank you for watching the video.